It's a pleasure having you on SaharaTv, Barrister.
Thank you for having me.
Let us get your initial reaction on the recent arrest of the EFCC chairman, Ibrahim Magu, wherein he was taken directly to the Presidential Villa, Abuja, to appear before a presidential panel sitting at the banquet hall of the villa on alleged corruption and insubordination. What was your initial reaction on this?
When I first read the breaking news by Sahara reporters, I knew that all was not well. What had happened in the last few hours have clearly vindicated the first report by Sahara reporters that indeed the acting chairman of the EFCC was actually arrested, contrary to the insinuation by the commission spokesperson that he was merely invited. And I have made the point that you cannot have an invitation being extended in the manner that this took place, where someone was stopped on the road and was forced to appear before a panel. That was clearly an arrest. So they did not have to deny it. And for them to have denied it further dents the credibility of the EFCC. But on the point itself, I am not surprised that this embarrassing episode has resulted in what we have seen. Magu's tenure as the acting chairman of the EFCC has been characterized by controversies. In the last 4 to 5 years, Mr. Magu has been acting in that capacity. He has not been confirmed as the substantive chairman of the commission. That is a contributory factor to what has happened, because the president of the country has completely and totally failed to take charge of his government. We have seen complete and unparalleled dysfunction in this administration. When you have an agency as important as the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, under an administration, under a regime that came with a mantra of fighting corruption, one would have expected that a serious president I note, would have taken it as a matter of priority to ensure that that commission or agency is led devoid of controversy, without controversy, that the leadership of that organization is structured in a manner that will achieve the anti-corruption drive of the administration. But because the Buhari regime had given the excuse that it was Senator Bukola Saraki and his colleagues in the Senate who frustrated the confirmation of Magu, even though the Saraki Senate, rightly or wrongly, actually relied on a report by the State Security Service, the SSS, which is an agency that reports directly to the president. So even though the tenure of that Senate had elapsed, and we now have a new Senate led by the APC, the president has not submitted Magu's name for confirmation as substantive chairman. I am giving that preliminary point to underscore the incidents of the last 24 hours. Now, what has happened is very clear to me. There is a power play with the presidency. There are people within the presidency who are not comfortable with Mr. Magu. There is no doubt about that.
Now, let me take you up on that, Barrister, because, I mean, yourself and some other analysts, political analysts and watchers have alluded to the fact that the arrest of Ibrahim Magu is a result of a power play between Magu and a power block led by the Attorney General of the Federation. What's your take on this, sir?
For me, it is even very embarrassing, very, very embarrassing that the Attorney General of the Federation had to issue a report or send recommendations to the president indicting the Magu and recommending a replacement. These are issues that in a serious administration would have been handled very quietly, discreetly. But because the Attorney General himself understands that the Nigerian presidency is basically on a standstill, that the Nigerian presidency is not functioning the way it is supposed to function. He also understands that the president himself does not seem to know what is happening in the country. So that report had to be leaked to the press so that the president can be compelled one way or the other to respond. And you saw that it was upon the leakage of that report by the Attorney General that the president constituted what they now call an investigative panel. The point is that I am convinced that there is a power play within the presidency, that some factions are not comfortable, a certain faction is not comfortable with the work of Mr. Magu. And that is the faction that has now precipitated his arrest and detention and interrogation. But the point we must not miss is that while that power play is going on, the substance of the allegations against Mr. Magu have to be closely and carefully examined. We should not be carried away by the seeming power play to undermine the substance of the allegations against him, including the issue of the lack of accountability on the recovered loot. Nigerians are very much interested in knowing how much has actually been recovered since this so-called war on corruption started. We want to know where these monies are. We want to know the person from which these monies were recovered. You see clearly that even the Attorney General in his own report also raised that issue. That is not an issue that should be swept under the carpet. Because if you claim you are fighting corruption and that loot have been recovered and the same loots are being relooted, it's not something that we must tolerate. It is not something that is tolerable. But at the same time, you have also seen that clearly this administration, this regime has never been interested in fighting corruption. What they are doing is just a selective war against corruption. It is partisan, it is clearly without credibility. But chieftains of the ruling APC have been shielded, have been protected. Corruption cases against them have been discontinued, even by the Attorney General himself. The same person is now insisting that Magu should be removed. He also has serious questions to answer. So when you look at what has happened, one wonders why Magu is being held to account. After 4 or 5 years, he has been acting in that capacity, and the Attorney General himself also has serious accountability questions. So it is a case of corruption fighting corruption. I think that is what is happening. It is a case of the hunter becoming the hunted.
Now, Barrister, let me also get your perspective on this, because you seem to actually raise a very, very crucial issue there. Can we contest the fact that the Attorney General of the Federation himself, that's Malami, may have been exploiting his own alleged loyalty and closeness to the president for his personal and power block agenda?
Looking at what has happened, I am not convinced that any of the characters who are involved in this episode are necessarily acting in the national interest. Indeed, even President Muhammadu Buhari himself cannot be said to be acting in the national interest. This is just a sinister plot of rivalries, of competing interests within the current regime to outdo one another. So if the president is acting in the national interest, ordinarily, you cannot tell me that Magu is the only person in Nigeria who can fight corruption. I don't believe that. So why has the president, one, not resubmitted his name for confirmation if he's so convinced that Magu is the only person that lead the EFCC at this time? Why? More than 1 year after the current Senate was inaugurated. So if that is the case, it therefore means that the president doesn't have confidence in Magu. Because if he has confidence in him, the moment the current Senate was inaugurated, the president should have resubmitted his name for confirmation. But because the president has returned him, the same way he has returned the service chiefs, who are also incompetent, this president seems to have a sort of unbroken affinity with incompetence. Like I said, he seems to have a blood covenant with failure. That is why everybody in this government that is being accused of incompetence, being accused of failure, the president has continued to keep them in office. The same way he has kept Magu is the same way he has kept the service chiefs. So this is clearly a dysfunctional presidency. But in having all this conversation, we must not lose sight of what the substance is, which is that there are grave allegations against Mr. Magu that he has to respond to. But we also want the Attorney General himself to account for the role he has played in the so-called war against corruption, including the
exactly. In fact, let me also take you up on that, because I mean it's quite ironical, to say the least. I mean, has Malami, that's the Attorney General himself, has he himself ever manifested any genuine commitment to the anti-corruption fight, considering some of the issues that has been raised? For example, the null prosecute entered in a case of corruption against Orubebe in relation to alleged malfeasance by one minister of the Niger Delta Ministry. We remember his secret meeting with the fugitive Maina in Dubai under whatever guise or excuse. And you look at his involvement in the surreptitious rejection of the same Maina into the civil service. Not to talk of his supervision of the Obono Oblast kangaroo asset recovery outfit, which Obono subsequently ran out of the country when exposed by some ICPC investigation. And his role, the role which he played in the PID matter since 2015, it was eventually blown up by financial damage to the country. I mean, all these, actually calls to question the commitment himself of the Attorney General. What's your perspective on this, sir?
I start with that apology that Mr. Malami is saying is about the worst, one of the worst Attorney General that this country has ever had. Under his watch, the Federal Ministry of Justice has been almost paralyzed. The war against corruption under Mr. Malami has taken a nosedive. High-profile cases, including the ones you have highlighted, those are just few examples of high-profile cases, serious crimes that this Attorney General has truncated. You are also aware of the case of the soldiers, the recent case of the soldiers who were arrested in the kidnap where policemen were killed. The Attorney General took steps to ensure that those military officials have not been prosecuted, contrary to his oath of office, contrary to his constitutional responsibility under Section 174 of the Constitution, to act in the public interest, to act in the interest of justice. This Attorney General has clearly and consistently taken steps to derail whatever looks like a fight against corruption. So I am not even convinced. That is why I said that this is a case of corruption fighting corruption. I am not convinced that Mr. Malami genuinely wants the EFCC to be repositioned. I am not convinced that Mr. Malami is fighting with Magu because he believes Magu is corrupt or because he believes Magu is incompetent. On the contrary, this is just a manifestation of sinister, personal, and insatiable interests of people in power. Mr. Malami has not demonstrated the integrity that is required of his office as Attorney General. Look at in the area of rule of law. You have seen this Attorney General going on public record to desecrate court orders, to defend the disobedience to court orders, like we saw in Showere's case, like we have seen in several other cases, where under his watch, subsisting and valid court orders have been treated with disdain and contempt. That is not an Attorney General that can teach Nigerians about the integrity of the office of the acting chairman of the EFCC. But that is without prejudice to the grave allegations against Magu himself. I am making the point that Mr. Malami is not a saint. And the fact that he's still the Attorney General, again, is a further corroboration of the point I made, that this President, Muhammadu Buhari, has a blood covenant with incompetent people. He has a covenant with failure. He has a covenant with inefficiency. This president pretends to be fighting corruption. But when you look at Buhari clearly, not only does he associate with corrupt people, not only does he endorse corrupt people, he also shields corrupt people. That is why you see President Buhari associating people like Governor Kanduje to the point of even endorsing him during the election. That is why you see him protecting chieftains of his party. That is why someone, a foreign like Maina, could, before he was arrested, could publicly go on record to say that he still had a meeting with the president, even when he was being wanted by anti-corruption agencies. So this president is a hypocrite. He's not interested in fighting corruption. That is why people like Malami can still remain in office, because Buhari is clearly not working in the interest of the Nigerian people. The same way he has retained the service chief, is the same way he has Mako, is the same way he has retained Malami. But you know the intriguing part of this, when the president realized that there was what looks like a security breach with the State House, where the DC of the First Lady of his wife was reported to have engaged in a shootout or to have fired a gun within the presence of the villa. What did Buhari do? Buhari fired, completely dismantled his personal security architecture. He fired his chief security officer and hired new people and replaced them with people who can protect him. But when it comes to the interest of Nigeria, when it comes to defending the interests of the Nigerian people, this president only allows incompetent people to remain in office. So you see how selfish that this president is. That when it affects him personally, he acts swiftly, he acts immediately, he acts in a manner that shows that he's a general when it affects him. But when it affects the interests of the Nigerian people, notwithstanding the hundreds of people who are being slaughtered by the so-called bandits, notwithstanding the rampage by Boko Haram that are killing Nigerians, the president has allowed the service chiefs to remain in office. Look at the embarrassment that we saw recently when the president issued a statement through his media spokesperson to say that he will no longer tolerate excuses from the service chief. What can be more embarrassing? What can be more shameful? What can be more scandalous for a retired general who vowed to fight from the front to now do a statement to say, I will no longer tolerate excuses, which is a tacit admission that the government has failed. So if the president is aware that the service chiefs have been giving him excuses, why have you not fired them the way you fired your own personal security men, your personal security officer, when there was breach in the State House? Why have you allowed the service chiefs who have failed to protect Nigerians to continue to remain in office? That is the same thing that he has done in the case of the EST. That is the same thing he has done in the case of the Attorney General. Even though there are clear evidence, there is clear indication, the facts are compelling that these are no longer working in the interest or the overriding interest of the Nigerian people. Buhari continues to keep them in office. Why? Because show me your friend and I'll tell you who you are. The people that he has to share with is the reflection of who he is. And I make the point that even if you cannot find competent people among the living to lead EFCC, why not look for them among the dead? Because if this president has consistently appointed dead people into positions, if he now believes that there is no living person in Nigeria that can replace Marco, let Buhari look for a dead person as he has always done and appoint to replace him. What we must not tolerate is to have an EFCC that is being led by a man whose tenure has now been riddled with controversy. An EFCC man that has been detained for 24 hours on allegations of corruption. Whether that allegation is correct or not, then because he has been arrested under the regime that he is serving, because he has been detained, because he's facing interrogation, if Nigeria was a serious country, Marco would have personally and honorably resigned if he still had honor.
Good.
To allow him to remain in office.
Now, let me get your view on that, because I mean, we're running out of time. I mean, with respect to that, sir, the question we want to ask now is, based on these allegations and the substance of the allegations, just as you have said, will you subscribe to having the EFCC chairman, Ibrahim Magu, step aside now to allow an unhindered probe into the allegations leveled against him?
Look, legally speaking, his continuous stay in office isn't questionable. I was one of the lawyers who filed an action in court at the Federal High Court in Abuja before Honorable Justice Binta Nyako in the a case that we filed to say that because at the time the Senate rejected the confirmation of Magu, they were principal officers of the Senate, including the then Senate President Saraki, who were under active or ongoing criminal investigation or trial, that their decision to reject him was in contravention of the Code of Conduct under the 5th Schedule as it relates to conflict of interest. And in that suit that I filed, I highlighted 7 senators at that time who were under investigation or who were being prosecuted by the EFCC. And I said, look, that there was no way they could have acted dispassionately in the confirmation process when they themselves are under investigation or trial by the EFCC led by Magu. So I referred that case to say that the process of rejecting him was flawed. Why am I making that point? I am saying that at one point or the other, some of us have had to make personal sacrifices to defend the institution of the EFCC. But at this point, we cannot continue to remain quiet because whichever way this so-called investigation goes, because I don't even have confidence in the investigation to begin with. Why? Other investigations have been done by this regime. Nothing came out of those investigations. Nothing came out of those investigations. So if they are now serious, if they believe that this is a genuine investigation and Magu knows that he's complicit, he should resign. But even if he believes that he's innocent, he should still resign. Having spent one day, having spent a night in the police station, how do you expect a chairman of an anti-corruption agency to now be arresting people for corruption when he himself has been arrested, publicly humiliated, publicly embarrassed, and made to spend a night in police cell? That is not the kind of individual that will now be arresting people for corruption. For you to lead EFCC, you don't just need legal footing. You also need a moral pedestal to stand on. You also need a high ethical background. So if this EFCC has been totally and completely ridiculed and embarrassed, Magu no longer has the moral standing. Magu no longer has the reputation to lead the EFCC. He should honorably resign. But guess what? If eventually the investigation results in his exoneration and the panel says the allegations by the Attorney Generals are false, that Magu has no case to answer, I expect the Attorney General himself to resign in protest, because the implication would be that he lied. It will mean that Mr. Malami lied. If at the end of the day Magu is found not to be complicit, it means that he lied or that he does not have integrity. So if he does not resign, then we are going to question his integrity, because that would have meant that he lied, that what he said against Magu was not correct. So whichever way it goes, I believe that not only Magu, but both Magu and Mr. Malami should be fired. Magu has already spent close to 4 or 5 years in office, which is about the statutory tenure for a substantive chairman. You cannot have an acting chairman exhausting a tenure that is meant for a substantive chairman, because the whole principle of law of having an acting appointment under the Interpretation Act is for that person to act for a temporary period. But Magu has now nearly spent or has spent the statutory period that a substantive chairman is meant to act. He cannot be acting ad infinitum. He cannot be acting indefinitely. So since the president has refused to send his name to the current Senate for confirmation, there is no legal or moral basis for Magu to remain in office. As at this moment, I expect that Magu should leave office on his own volition or should be made to do so by the president.
Now, finally, what does this portend for the anti-corruption war of Mr. President in this regard? And what does this, how does this place Nigeria in the Committee of Nations as far as the fight against corruption is concerned?
The admission, the arrest, detention and interrogation of Magu is an admission against interest. There's a principle under the law of evidence known as admission against interest, where a party makes concession to a fact that is adverse to his interest or that is suggestive of a fact that is not in his interest. Why am I saying that? Buhari has been claiming that he's fighting corruption because the chairman, the man that is leading the fight against corruption, is now being seriously questioned for corruption, has been arrested, has been detained for fighting for corruption. That clearly shows that the government was never serious in fighting corruption, particularly because the most serious, the chronicle allegations against him came directly from the Attorney General of the Federation, the chief law officer of the country. That clearly shows that there was no genuine fight against corruption. But also, I am also afraid, I am terribly afraid that if Magu is eventually removed and is replaced by a stooge or a protege of the faction of the cabal in a presidency that is against him, whatever is left of the pretentious war against corruption may be totally derailed. So that is a fear that I know, that is a fear that I have. That what if the replacement of Magu is worse than Magu? What will now happen to some of the cases that Magu has been able to institute, given the history, the antecedents of Malami as Attorney General, who has discontinued high-profile cases that the EFCC under Magu has instituted? So Nigerians must be watchful. Nigerians should not sleep. This is not a time for us to be carried away. We have to watch very closely how this plays out eventually. And I am hoping and praying that whoever is going to be appointed ultimately as a replacement should be somebody whose allegiance does not lie to the ruling party, whose allegiance does not lie to a cabal, but whose allegiance lies to the Nigerian people, whose allegiance lies to the Constitution. Somebody who will be willing to risk his life, to stake his life, to defend the country, to fight corruption without looking at the face of the president, without looking at who is a loyalist, who is a party man, or who is financing the ruling party. If eventually Magu is removed, as we expect, I also expect that we should have a new Attorney General. But if it is only Magu that is going to be removed, whoever is going to replace him should be somebody that is above board, somebody that can act without being influenced by any other authority or person.